Hi everyone, it is time to talk about all the books that I read in the second half of February. I had a really great reading month in February. All of the ones I'm going to talk about that I read in that second half of the month, I gave 4 stars and then 1 5-star. So everything was great. Before I get to the ones that were from February, I'm also going to talk about a few books that I wasn't able to review earlier because of the Harper strike, and that is over now. And so I only had like a few books from one series and then one other book, and I didn't think I should do a whole other video, so I'm just going to talk about those first and then get to the books I read in the second half of February. So let's start with those HarperCollins books. Like I said, there's only 4, and 3 of them are all from one series, and that is the Chronicles of Narnia. I read The Horse and His Boy, The Magician's Nephew, and The Last Battle. And so I was reading these in the original publication order, so that's why it's kind of like a weird order, because this is like 3, 1, 7 in the like chronological order. But like I said, I read them in publication order. The Horse and His Boy kind of takes place during the time when the Pevensey children are king and queen of Narnia, but it's taking place in a different area. It's not in Narnia for most of the book. And this one is just kind of like an adventure story about this boy and his talking horse. It's a Narnian horse. And they go on an adventure. And I really enjoyed this. There is some stuff, since they're in a different country, the way that the people of that country are described is, fairly racist. And so if you're going to read this with kids, I would want to have discussions with my kids, because I could tell that this, fictional country is supposed to represent people like from the Middle East probably. And so it's not really an appropriate description. And so I would have, if I was going to read this with my daughter, which I didn't read any of these with my kids this time, I wanted to see what they were like first. If I were going to read this with my daughter, I would want to discuss that in more detail. But it was a fun adventure story. I kind of enjoyed following him and his horse, and then also there was a girl he becomes friends with and her horse. So it was just a fun adventure story. Then I read The Magician's Nephew, and this one is one of my favorites, I think, now of the Chronicles of Narnia. I just really like it. It's an origin story for Narnia about, this boy who is from our world and then travels to where he gets to like see the very beginnings of Narnia and the creation. It definitely has a lot of like biblical allegories, but I am a really big fan of reading mythology, and that's what this feels like, because it is like a creation story for a world. And so I really enjoyed this, and I would probably read this one with my daughter because I thought it was a fun story. And also we see the evil queen who, is like in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. We see her kind of origin story as well in this one. So that was interesting. And then I read The Last Battle, and this was horrible. These two, I think I gave 4 or 5 stars. I can't remember. I think I gave 4 stars and then 5 stars. And this one was a 2-star. This is my least favorite in the series, and probably will never read this one again. Like if I were to reread other ones from the series with my kids, I would leave this one out. If my kids want to read it when they're older by themselves, that's their choice. But while I am still kind of choosing what they read, I will not be reading this with them, because there is a lot of racist ideas in this. I really did not enjoy it. And plus, I just didn't think it was that good of a story, even if you took out the racism. I thought it was a very weak storyline compared to a lot of the other books in the series. And it's really not necessary, because the way this series is kind of later on, it's not like it's continuing on. Yes, there are some characters in this that were in earlier books, but this didn't need to happen in order to feel conclusion. Not a good book in my opinion. So that is me finishing the Chronicles of Narnia. So I'm glad that I finished the series, but I will never return to The Last Battle again. And then I read Pandoras Jar, Women in the Greek Myths by Natalie Haynes. And this one was really good. I gave it 4 stars. This is a collection of essays, and so it's nonfiction, and she is approaching different women in Greek mythology and kind of telling their story from different points of view. When I started reading this, I wasn't sure what I was going to get. I didn't know if it was going to be retellings. I knew it was nonfiction, so I didn't really know how that was going to work. This very much feels like you're listening to a lecture. Reading it is like the written version of a, college lecture. And I'm not saying that in a negative way. If I had money, I would go and sit in on different classes that I found interesting in college. But that's the feel, because it's very like scholarly the way she approaches these women. So like, for example, Pandora. So she's looking at Pandora, how she is portrayed in different Greek myths from different people, because, you know, Greek mythology or any mythology doesn't really have an origin story. So you can't really point like this is the first story, because it was, you know, they were myths that were passed along orally for a long time before they were put down. So you can't even like say that, you know, the Odyssey was just Homer's creation, because a lot of that would have come oral tradition before he ever wrote it down. He's just the one that's famous for writing it all down. So that's what she is kind of like saying, that she's looking at, you know, some of the most famous depictions of these women, and then like also looking at artwork at the time, which would have given more of a view of what people living during that time and the average Greeks would have thought of these different women, because the way they are portrayed would have been based on the oral traditions that they were told. And then also looking at some more modern interpretations of these women. And it was just really interesting, like, and looking at the comparisons with other mythology too. Like Pandora can really be compared a lot with Eve from the Christian Bible, in the way that she's kind of blamed for all of the bad things that happened to humanity. So it was really interesting. I just, you know, it took me a little bit to realize to approach this differently. This is going to be very scholarly and kind of a laying out of a lot of different ways to look at these women. But I found it very interesting and would recommend it if you're interested in Greek mythology and want to see how the view of different women in the myths have changed over time, you know, and the way we see them in modern day or think about them, just like, you know, us just being exposed to Greek mythology a lot in our culture, and how that view might have been different back when these myths were actually being told. So yeah, those are all the books that were part of the HarperCollins strike. So now on to the things that I actually read in February. So first I'm going to talk about the only read aloud I did with my daughter, and that was Odd and the Frost Giants by Neil Gaiman, and this is the version that's illustrated by Chris Riddell, which is the version I would recommend if you're going to read this, because I just love his illustrations. They're like full page. Sometimes they cover both pages. It's not in color. It's all in this kind of like silver and black color palette, but really nice pictures that add to the story. My daughter and I are currently studying the Vikings and Norse mythology, and that's why we did this as our read aloud, because this is based off of Norse mythology. We see some of the most famous gods from mythology in here. They're frost giants. So it's definitely in Norse mythology if you are interested in that. In the story, we are following Odd, who is living in this area that kind of seems like it's having endless winter. Like winter just keeps going on past the time when it should. And then he encounters some gods and finds out that there's a reason why this winter is happening, and he needs to go and help the gods to save Midgard, which is Earth, from having this endless winter. And it's just a fun adventure story rooted in Norse mythology. And then moving on to my 4-star reads, which are the majority of things that I read in the second half of February. I did want to read more romance in February, and that just didn't really happen. I ended up reading 2 romances, 1 adult romance and 1 young adult romance, and I really enjoyed them both. This one is Our Way Back to Always by Nina Moreno, and this is, like I said, a young adult romance, so we have 2 high schoolers, and this is kind of like a second chance / friends to lovers. So these 2 were best friends growing up. They had this list, like bucket list of things they wanted to do before they graduated, but then in middle school something happens that makes it so that they don't talk to each other for the first 3 years of high school. Now it's their senior year, and they kind of like get back together, become friends again through this like bucket list that they were supposed to be doing, and they want to achieve those things before the end of school. This like revives their friendship. They kind of work through what went wrong, and, you know, start to rely on each other again, and obviously romance ensues, because you can tell it's a romance novel. Lately, I have just not really been enjoying young adult romances, so I've been avoiding them, but I wanted to pick this one up because I had read the author's other novel, and while I enjoyed it, I didn't really love the romance, but I loved the like family dynamics, so I thought at least I'm gonna like the characters. And this one, I really loved the characters, and I loved the romance. So it was much better for me than her previous novel in terms of like romance. And yeah, I just really enjoyed it. I think that, you know, sometimes second chance romance doesn't work for people because they're like, why didn't it work the first time? Well, you know, this is more like the fact that they were young, and, you know, you make mistakes when you're in middle school and, you know, don't really communicate very well with each other because you're kids. And so now that they're, you know, closer to like 18, they're working through those things. There is some like miscommunication, but it's more that they're like worried that things are going to fall apart again, that they've had that conflict in the past and they need to build the trust up again. So I think the miscommunication works in this because of that. And I just really love the way that they rebuild this relationship with each other. And there's also like family dynamics. There's grief. The boy has recently lost his father. So he's working through grief and figuring out what to do next in life because he's also trying to help his mom support the family. And then she is just trying to figure out what her next stage in life is because she doesn't really have the grades to get into a good college. And her sister, who was supposed to go to college, is now pregnant, is a pregnant teen, and so didn't end up going to college. And now she feels like it's up to her to like go to college. But is that really her path? And so there is some of that kind of extra stuff, family stuff going on, but I also just really loved the romance. So I would recommend this even if you're not a huge fan of young adult romance. There's not a lot of like the teen angst. There's obviously like teen issues going on, like them figuring out what's next in life, but it didn't feel as angsty. It just felt like real people trying to work on their relationship and figure out what's next in their life, and I really loved it. And then I read The Matchmakers' Lonely Heart by Nancy Campbell Allen, which is a historical romance, which I had heard people talking about this. I heard several friends recommending this, and I didn't realize that this is also a murder mystery. I should have figured that out by listening to people describe it, but I just didn't really put that together, that yes, this is historical, but this is also definitely like a murder mystery with romance in it. So we are following this woman who writes for a magazine, and she's like kind of like setting people up, like, you know, men and women up to hopefully get married, and, you know, working for this women's magazine. And she's like, has just like done this setup, and she's kind of like observing the person's date by secret, and she is caught by this detective who is investigating the man in that couple. And so they end up like pairing up together to try to investigate this man because the detective thinks that he murdered his late wife. And, you know, now he's like back on the market again. So, you know, he's worried that he might go after some other young woman. And so they're like pairing together to solve this murder, find out this man really did kill his wife. All of that kind of stuff that would happen in like a murder mystery, like detective type thing. But then also they're getting to know each other. And it's a very slow burn romance because this is in the proper romance line, so there's not going to be anything beyond kissing in this one. And I just thought it was really delightful. I really liked both of our main characters. I liked that they had kind of that like banter. It wasn't necessarily hate to love. It was more that like they did not see eye to eye on this. Like from the beginning, she's like, no way did this man kill his wife. And he's like, you know, I really do suspect that he killed his wife. And so they're on opposite sides of this thing, but then, you know, they start to get to know each other and start to like see each other's opinions and all that. And I really ended up enjoying this one and want to continue the series. This is like a companion set of novels in the series, and I'm already excited because she has like this group of 3 women that are friends. I think they're also cousins. So I'm assuming that the next book will be from one of her cousins, and then I would assume there will also be a 3rd book from the 3rd cousin. And so I'm excited to read all the books in this series. Next, I have a couple buddy reads that I did in February. I read Pet by Akwaeke Emezi, and I read this with my friend Lynn. And we both really enjoyed this. It was 4 stars for me. And this is one where it's really short, and I've heard so many people talk about this book because it was very popular, what was it, like 2 years ago? And I still didn't really know what it was about. And I think part of that is because this is one of those that you just have to be there to watch it unfold. Basically, we are following this girl named Jam, and she is living in this it's kind of this utopian society that has gotten rid of all of the monsters being, you know, people that have done bad things, and is kind of just, yeah, like it's become this utopian. But this is kind of like saying, is it really utopian? Is there like no monsters around, or are we just refusing to look for them now that we think that everything's all good? And I just thought this was really excellent. The writing in this was so nice. I mean, it wasn't overly flowery or anything, but there were times I just like had to stop and reread a paragraph because I just really thought it was impactful, and I really enjoyed the way it was written. I love our main character of Jam, except for the only thing I had an issue with was that I couldn't really tell about the age. Like, I knew how old Jam was based on some stuff that was said in the book. Like, she was discussing her transition, and because Jam is transgender, and discussing her transition, and like when she had different things happening and saying like, well, this is when I started my hormone therapy, and this is when I had my surgery. So I know how old she is. I know she's 16 in this book, but she reads like she's more like 13, 14. And so I got kind of confused because I kept picturing her and her best friend as being more like middle school, early high school, like 9th grade type of age, but she'd be 16, so she would be older high school or middle high school, not middle school. And so that was kind of like confusing for me because it definitely reads like they're in middle school. And so that was the only thing that kind of kept me from like fully giving it 5 stars, because I kept getting like jarred in like how I was imagining Jam and how she is supposed to be. Yeah, so that was my only confusion, is that she reads more like a middle schooler than a high schooler, even though it is stated that she is 16. But this one, I just think it tackles a lot of like issues and like talking about whether we want to like actually see the things that are, you know, if there's someone in our lives that we love, but they might be doing something bad, do we, you know, gloss that over and pretend it's not happening? And, you know, are we not willing to see these things once we think that everything's all good? And I just think there was a lot of great topics discussed in this. And I definitely will try out more books written by MSE because I really enjoy the writing in this. My other buddy read was The Book of Lost Things by John Connolly. And I read this with Berna from Berna's Bookish Adventures. I'll link her down below. And this one was an interesting one because, okay, so I'll tell you what this is about, but then I'll explain why this one really threw me for a loop at first. So we are following a boy named David, and his mother has just passed away, and so his father remarries very quickly after his mother's passing, and so he goes to live with his father at his like stepmother's big home, and then things start to happen. He's living in this room with a bunch of books, and the books start to talk to him, and he starts to have dreams of this crooked man. That's what he calls him, the crooked man. And it becomes this whole like almost fairy tale adventure where he ends up entering this other world searching for this book of lost things. And so that's what it's like about. And listening to that description sounds like a middle grade book. Looking at the cover, looks like a middle grade book. I picked this up in the children's section of Barnes & Noble. So I assumed it was a middle grade book, but I don't really know who this is written for, because this is very dark and very violent. And not saying that like you can't have any of that, like a dark fantasy, a dark fairy tale in middle grade, but you know, middle grade is usually 8 years old to like 12. Well, I definitely would not give this to an 8-year-old. I have an 8-year-old. I would never give this to my 8-year-old. I would like think, you know, every kid is different, but I would think this is targeted at probably more like 11 and older, but our main character is like 12. So like, I wouldn't think a high schooler would gravitate towards something that has a 12-year-old as the main character. So yeah, it's like a weird thing. I think it's either targeted right at that like 11 to 13 age, or like adults that like to read dark fairy tales, because I really enjoyed it. Berna enjoyed it. We had a good time with it. But it got confused. Like for the first half of the book, I was like, who is this written for? I don't know. So just go with it. If you are someone that likes dark fairy tales and you're an adult, pick it up. If you're getting this for a kid, I would read it first to make sure, you know, if your kid can handle it. Because there are some definitely dark things. I'm not just talking like death or something. Like, I don't know, like we're talking very like some gruesome things, very dark things happening here. I can put some content warnings down in the like description just in case you did want to like get this for a kid and you want to know what exactly I'm talking about, because there's a lot of stuff in it. So I'll put a few kind of like content warnings down there. But moving beyond that, me and my confusion of who this is written for, if you are an adult that likes dark fantasy and you like reading kind of, the reason I say you like reading middle grade, because we are following a 12-year-old, the themes feel very much like a middle grade book, because it's like exploring themes of accepting family and grief and all that, but it is very much targeted. Like the way the themes are approached feels targeted towards a younger audience, so it's not like a mature approach to the themes, but mature content, if that makes any sense. But the like fantasy world, this other world that he goes to, is very fascinating. It's full of a lot of different like characters from fairy tales, so you can see little snippets of different fairy tales. That is very much done in a way that would be like reminiscent of Grimm's fairy tales, so it's like the darker version, not like the Disney version of the fairy tales. And just like, yeah, really fun and interesting. If you like a dark fairy tale, then I would recommend it, but I wouldn't recommend it to your 8-year-old, in my opinion. So yes, like I said, do with that in terms of like who I would recommend it to, but it is like a dark fairy tale. And then let's end off with my 5-star read of the month. I read Emma by Jane Austen, and I absolutely love this, which I thought I would, because I have watched a lot of the different adaptations for Jane Austen's work before I went about reading all of her work in the last year. And when it came to adaptations, Emma is one of my favorite like adaptations on film. Whether it's the like more modern one of Clueless, I still love Clueless and watch it like a lot. I love a lot of the adaptation, like the actual adaptations of this book, whether it's the Gwyneth Paltrow one from like, was that from the 90s, or like the newest Emma, the one that has the random period at the end. I don't know, it's like Emma period. That one was great. I like the like one that's, is it called a miniseries when it's like split up into 4 that has Johnny Lee Miller? Yeah. All of those versions I love. So I kind of suspected that I would love Emma, and I did. But the reason I loved this isn't just because I love the like arc of Emma. Like Emma goes on a growth arc during this book that I really enjoy, but that's not really the reason I enjoy this. I love this because of all the side characters. It's the same reason I love Pride and Prejudice, and why these 2 books, I have to read them someday back to back to find out which one is my favorite Jane Austen. But the reason I love both Emma and Pride and Prejudice, and why those are like my favorite of her work, is because of all the side characters. She creates an entire community of people, and you really get to know all of them. If you've seen any of the adaptations or read the book, you know, it's like not just about her and her love interest, you know, there is an entire community. It's like Gilmore Girls, but like the original, you know, where it all comes alive because there are all these side characters that Emma is relating to, how they are seeing Emma, how Emma is seeing them, and how that changes over the novel, and also how those relationships become different over the novel, and just having a whole community of people. I just really enjoyed this. I love all of the characters, even the ones that are not good characters, and as in like not necessarily good people. I still love the way they're written and their scenes with Emma, and yeah, just love everything about this. Definitely 5 stars. One of my favorite Austens. This and Pride and Prejudice for now are tied until I read them close enough together to know which one I love most. And yeah, that's all I have to say about that. Loved it. And that is it. Those are my HarperCollins books that I need to review, and then all of the books I read in the second half of February. If you would like to talk about any of these books down below, I would love to hear from you, and I will see you next time. Bye.